I just have a little introduction just to kind of give a sense of why we are hosting this community conversation. So it's called Let's Talk Water. And so we're hoping for this kind of informal gathering of people to discuss issues related to the topic of water. We have some invited guests, but we've also invited general public to take part and have a seat around the circle. I want to also, it's obvious, but this is being recorded too. This is part of a larger project that we're working on with artist Marianne Nicolson. So it's a pre-program for an ongoing project that will happen and kind of unfold over the next few years, called Wawi Tlala, the Pervasiveness of Water, or Cannot Go Against the Tide. We're still talking and thinking about the title and the ideas. I also wanted to give a bit of an introduction about the importance of this site and the physical place we're on today. So we are on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, which include the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And this area here, and this stretches through around the harbor by the Empress, in Lekwungen is known as Hosekum, I hope I'm saying that right, or Muddy Place, which used to be tidal flats. So where the Empress now sits were tidal flats that provided a range of resources for the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And the harbor itself is also historically significant and complex site in terms of the shared history between the First Nations and non-First Nations in this area. So I just want to extend our gratitude as visitors on this territory to hold this conversation here about this really kind of important and crucial topic that reaches into so many aspects of our lives. As we've been talking over the last few days, so many different things, it all of a sudden comes around to connections to water, and it's just such a, I mean, that in the title of what we're working on, the pervasiveness of water, it kind of reaches so many aspects of our lives. So I'll just go through the invited speakers we have today. So we have Marianne Nicolson, Victoria-based artist of Scottish and... Did you say?
Do it, you can do it.
I got it.
Zawadeno.
Thank you very much. First Nations descent. I gotta practice that. I'm so sorry. An artist, Lucy Aukafolau, who has been our artist in residence for the past month, this June. She's based in Berlin right now, but she's of Tongan and European descent. And her work is currently a part of the exhibition at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, Trans-Pacific Transmissions, Video Art Across the Pacific, curated by our curator Haema Sivanesan. So great opportunity to see her work as well. We have Maddie Leach, who is actually working on a project with the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver and came over for the day to join us. And she's also has worked on projects that relate to water as well. And Tarah Hogue is currently our ordained Aboriginal Curatorial Fellow at the Art Gallery. And so this conversation will start by looking at how artists use their practice to highlight ideas and issues that relate to the pervasive and expansive topic that is water, but also to extend that to all of you, what issues are relevant to you, and in the light of this DIY kind of idea concept, what are solutions? Like, how do we overcome these things, or what are the possibilities to these issues and to these hurdles? So first I'll turn it over to Marianne. We'll just get a brief introduction from the artists about their practice and how they think about water in relation to some of the work they've done. So I'll start with you, Marianne.
Where I come from, our village is situated by a river called the Kwai River up in Kinkum Inlet. And so I kind of partly grew up in the city, but my family was from Kinkum, and so I would spend my summers as a teenager in Kinkum. And it really had an incredible impact on my kind of relationship to the land. It was really fundamental to us as people, and it still is, this relationship to this water body that was so constant. So you woke up in the morning and the river was there, and there was a kind of a daily life to that river. The tide would rise and it would fall, and basically our whole existence was tied into the life of the river itself. And so I grew up with this passion for this thing. People think of it as a thing, but it was a living thing, that's river. And it really shaped how I relate to kind of, I guess we would call it the natural world. And so this relationship, though, I found was really polar to the relationships to water that I was learning about, say, university or as I grew into adulthood, I realized that in oft times that relationship to the river was very objectified, and that our river systems were being kind of perceived of in a way that was foreign to me, and that was kind of as a source of power, particularly hydroelectric power. And so I ended up, I guess a few years ago, I created a piece. Well, I was was approached to put in a proposal to do a piece for the Vancouver airport, and I thought, well, I would like to do something that's somewhat political in its position, and I want to address the issue of water, because they had a theme that they wanted people to address, and that was, they basically said, we want you to address the history of the Fraser kind of Thompson River systems. And so I had been looking already at the history of the Columbia and the Fraser, and one of the things that really bothered me about the Columbia was that it had been down 14 times on its main line within a 50-year time period. And I guess Canada can kind of somewhat pat itself on the back somewhat in that the Fraser had not been dammed on its main line, but at the same time I was so concerned about the mentality that would create that situation where the Columbia would be dammed that many times on its main line within such a small time frame. And one of the really significant impacts of that damming was in 1957, and so we're not talking that long ago actually, 1957, when they built the second dam up from the mouth of the river of the Columbia. There was a place called Celilo Falls there, and that was the longest continuously inhabited site in North America. And when they dammed that site, when they built that dam, it flooded Celilo Falls. And the reason why it was so significant in terms of its indigenous history was that it was such a rich fishing site. So indigenous people many nations would gather there over thousands of years. So this place was covered in pictographs, and when they flooded that place, those pictographs then went underwater. And so this was the basis of the work that was created for the airport. So the images on the iPad show these two glass columns, and they're basically vertical rivers. And one of them represents the Fraser, the other one represents the Columbia, and they give in pictographic imagery this history. So, and I was really critical of, I should be really honest, I was really critical of this kind of like capitalist, extreme resource exploitive relationship. And I thought about my own personal relationship to the river in Kinkum, and I had real issues with it. And as these artworks were going up, I ended up in a conflict with the institution, because I put a text on the bottom of those pieces, and that text was reflective of, it was critical of this capitalist philosophy. But what was happening was that as the airport was going up, I realized that the context for the work itself was actually deeply embedded in these capitalist philosophies, and in fact was a very expensive mall. And so I felt compelled as an artist, and I thought, well, I've been hired to create the best artwork that I can possibly create, and so I put a text along the bottom, and it created a conflict with me and the institution. I was requested to remove the text. I removed the text, and now there is a pattern of dots that exist on that piece rather than the original text that I put on there. So it's just very interesting, the process of thinking through these things, creating a work around it, and then actually butting up against the various systems that I was trying to critically address in the works. And that's just kind of a little brief synopsis of the work that is on the iPad.
Do you mind saying what the text was?
It said, it was from the Bible, and it said, for what does it serve a man to gain the world and lose his soul?
They objected to that.
Yes.
And did they explain why, or what the objection was?
It was interesting. I was told, that I had not gone through the proper process to have that text on the works. So it should have been approved ahead of time. So on that basis, I did feel that I most likely had overstepped my... but I also had felt that it was so important as I saw the work going up that this text be included. Because I felt that the text itself addressed the fundamental issues that were important in the works, and that the work actually would become co-opted with the text. So it's very complex.
Does that change for you fundamentally how you feel about that work now with this absence or this change that you had to make?
No, I thought it was a really incredibly valuable lesson for me about systems and power and voice and activism. So that's the way I see it. It was a very difficult process to go through, but at the same time I think, and I don't necessarily think it was just a lesson for me. I think it was a lesson for other people who were involved in that process as well. It is what happened. So, and I think it simply reflects the reality of these issues in a broader framework, in a broader context.
Great, thank you, Marianne. So maybe we'll move on to Lucy next to speak about the project.
My work was a exploration, I guess, around the networks in Tonga, so in the Pacific, and it was a trip that I had done with my father and my uncle. We started in the main island and made our way up to a network with the Haega group where my grandfather is from. So it was about me finding a relationship with the water in a place that I knew of from stories, but not in a sense that I'd experienced it myself. So I looked at sort of psychogeography and how that sort of system works in a very land-based practice. And water for me is something that is an extension of land. It has no boundaries, so I wanted to immerse myself in an event or an activity that was so normal or regular to my father or people in Tonga, and kind of be an observer to gain an entry into something that I felt like I was a part of but hadn't given myself the opportunity to be there. So water for me was this system that kind of flowed in and out of the land, and how I managed that or how I approached it was different to me being in New Zealand or a different kind of island setting. So that's mainly the work, and it was an exploration of these moments in between when we're offloading and unloading provisions. The boat ride essentially is taking supplies from the main island and further New Zealand, Australia, and getting them to these smaller places. So it was about our sort of trip with these provisions, with these people taking provisions, and making our way back to our homeland, I guess.
Thank you. So maybe, Maddie, you could tell us a bit about your practice and specifically the work you did related to water.
Sure, yeah. So I thought that in this context, the work that I would talk about was a project I did last year. I was invited to be in the Jakarta Biennale in Indonesia. And one of the thematics for the Biennale was the theme of water. In terms of, I guess, really complex issues in Jakarta particularly, but other places in Indonesia around basic access to water for communities. And it's sort of a long narrative, the project, but I was also very interested in the fact that Indonesia is this, substantial producer of pulp and paper products, and so there are enormous corporations producing paper for the global industry and using an extraordinary amount of water resource to do that. And I used a very, I guess, a simple equation that I came across, that it takes 325 litres of water to produce 1 kilogram of A4 photocopy paper. And I used that to start an idea where, I guess, rather than representing that in other ways, I tried to ship 325 litres of water from a place called Blue Spring in the middle of the North Island. And the Blue Spring is in a little town called Tarah, where, amongst others, Coca-Cola bottle water and have done for a long time, or just pump water from there. And Tarah has this spring coming from underground aquifers, and it is the most beautiful sight and extremely pure. And the town supply for this little township is off this Blue Spring. And Coca-Cola and all the other water bottlers in that township always sort of market the idea that, you know, the water you're drinking comes straight from the source of the spring. But essentially they're just using the town supply, same thing. So they tap off the town supply, fill up bottles of water and sell it to New Zealanders. But also, and then there's also, I guess, you know, there's a really complex water bottling issue arising in New Zealand at the moment, as grants are being given to international companies to draw off billions of litres of water. But anyway, so I wanted to work with water bottling companies and said, you know, can I bring some barrels of water, can I fill up from your water bottling plant 325 litres of water? And none of them would have anything to do with me. And so I ended up working with local government, and they said sure, and they sort of actually got me closer to the spring than any of the water bottling companies, and we went out and back of a ute put these barrels filled up 325 litres, and then I worked with a shipping company which had this really great name called Divine Logistics, which I was hopeful that we would ship this water. And it went on a ship and went through New Zealand clearance, you know, relatively easily, and I paid just, you know, $700 or something to ship it. And then my plan was it would come to Indonesia, and I wanted to exchange this water with Asia Pulp and Paper, enormous paper manufacturing, one of their mills, and say, can I actually give you this beautiful water, and you can tip it into your processes, and then would you give me the amount of paper, you know, that it would contribute to producing? And Asia Pulp I tried to pursue through various means, you know, and again, of course, they're extremely difficult to kind of get any access point into a company like that. So knowing that, you know, that joining the conversation, and we sort of persisted, and I sent the water, and was assured that it would get clearance in Jakarta, and it did arrive in Jakarta. And then while the Biennale was being set up, I was waiting for, then what transpired was extremely complex bureaucracy around Indonesian customs officials and the clearance of this product. It would have been fine if it had been in water bottles, but in these two big blue barrels, it became this sort of suspect object that no one really knew how to deal with. And there was then this sort of pile of communications about payment And the New Zealand Embassy was involved as well at certain times to try to get this clearance for this water so it at least could come to the Biennale venue. And it became increasingly complex around millions of rupiah that would be paid over the table, and then openly discussed about millions of rupiah that were paid under the table to various people. So it became this massive headache for everybody. And in the end, what I was doing all along, right from when I got the invitation to the Biennale, was I was keeping every piece of communication and paperwork so I had about a bit over 400 email messages around this process, and I printed those on 1 kilogram of Asia copy paper, and that was really the document that became, because I had this space in the corner of a giant warehouse, and everyone had their artworks around, and I had this white empty space with this 1 kilogram of paper. So, and then I never. By the end of the Biennale, there was still, there were all sorts of promises and an extremely curious and very interesting, I thought, approach was working with the Indonesian people I was working with, about how things get through customs in a place like Indonesia, and we were never really sure how much money we'd paid in the end, and then the New Zealand Embassy got wind that this under the table payment had been made with New Zealand government money, and so this has become the point where they are. And the last piece of communication was that they were in a warehouse. I saw a bad cell phone photo of them sitting there, and they think they would have been either had the sort of, in the end they had the opportunity to, in some ways they become like a body that could be deported, returned to New Zealand, or destroyed, and I think, and it sat at that point for some time. I attempted to have them deported back to New Zealand to see what would happen going as New Zealand water coming back into New Zealand. But they're lost and gone, and they've become part of the disappeared kind of in Jakarta. So the project, I think, at the moment, I'm hoping to make a book publication around that, tracking that. It's it becomes a narrative. But I was really interested in this. The resistance, I guess, that a physical object like that faces, and it was, I guess it was it's better quality water than perhaps than many places or anywhere in Indonesia, but that it was unable to be categorized or recognized. So, yeah, that was the project that I was doing around water.
It seems like, in a way, each of your projects do have an aspect to them that your experience working on them is a layer that maybe we don't experience in the work, but becomes part of it, right? And I guess we were talking yesterday about artists and risk, right? So because you are all entering into this realm of activism in a way, where you're trying to highlight issues that might be contentious and might be controversial, and shedding light on them. What do you feel the role of the artist is in terms of taking on risk, and your role in terms of bringing these ideas or these concerns forward? How do you see your place in that, and how important is that idea of taking risk in the process?
Well, I think I'm really interested in risk, always. The project is always vulnerable, and I like to think the way that I like to work is that you kind of have a conceptual, you have this logic, and the idea that you just pursue the logic, and there's intervening forces going to work on that, and how far you can actually test something and intervene in people's time, is in a really interesting aspect of that for me, so that the community kind of is gathered around an object, as it attempts to traverse something. But often, and I have to be content with what people see as failure in the work, right? The non-arrival of something, but then it's actually, it's not a failure in that way. But I think risk for me is really important, as is uncertainty.
That process is also revealing the system, isn't it?
Definitely.
That's what it's bringing forward.
And I think this notion of sort of are you an activist, and I think it's because I'm always interested in that position where people can't be quite sure, which I think is really interesting about your text on that work, because people can't kind of out and out go, this is an outrage, like that you want to put this, or you're trying to do this, or you're working with Greenpeace, or whoever, that it's sort of sitting on that line of where it's not possible. They perceive a politic in the work, but it's not, and I get these, going, should one declare that more openly? But it's actually attempting to navigate these bureaucratic and capitalist processes to get something through them.
So the ambiguity becomes really important to the risk.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
How you deploy that ambiguity.
Yeah.
Also, just in terms of the publics in which your work circulates, your work, Lucy, is in the gallery, and you were telling me before about introducing some of the docents to the work and how they reacted to the silence in the work. Your film is silent, and so the way that the narrative is built around place is different. And then Marianne, your work is in this incredibly public space where people are traversing through it, fairly quickly on their way out of the airport. And so thinking about how those forms of encounter too are very different, and then how that work then presses upon the public, either sort of just as they're going by in the space, or as they're trying to interpret it for themselves in terms of your work, so they can figure out how they will then represent that work to the public.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me, the idea of the structures, because I found, like, especially within Indigenous negotiations around land, that there's an assumption of a structure in place that we are continually butting up against, because we have our own way of understanding that relationship, but we're asked to come to the table, and that structure is then imposed on us, but it's imposed on us under a myriad of assumptions that is the structure. And so for me, a lot of the process has been to attempt to pull back the curtains and really question the authority behind the assumed structures that are in place, or even the authority of, like, I was trying to compare the authority around a relationship to a river system, and that there was an assumed authority that humankind could use that system for the benefit of the human populations in the area, without balancing that notion with all the other systems that are connected to that system. And so I was fascinated with your project, because it really exposes how humans create these systems, and how we all almost agree to accept that those systems and contribute to them, and allow them to exist without questioning them, or even becoming somewhat blind to the fact that they are systems.
I think part of what's interesting about your work, Maddie, is that you play with logic as well, and that you come up with this formula, and you try to push that formula through to its logical conclusion, and how the system keeps disrupting that logic and isn't logical.
Yeah.
It's really amazing.
You might expect it to be.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, just something I've been thinking about a bit is this idea of kind of delays and wasting time of business and industry in this process, and it's sort of I think I need to think about it, but it's really it's like, I don't know, I was I had another project where I found myself attempting to put this block of concrete into the ocean, but I was talking to these 5 young oil executives from Australian worldwide exploration at this board table and telling them this is the story of something that what could have been whale oil and it wasn't, and it turns into concrete, and they all sat there. I remember they gave me sort of almost an hour of their time, and then said, we can't really help you, but it was, I think there's something about that is hugely intimate, I think, in the way that you become, the way that a work maybe infects itself across, I guess, different entities. Yeah.
It's a way of kind of situating yourself to a place or to a systems through an artwork or the process that is involved with that. I think a lot about that in my own curating, about situating the place that the exhibit is happening to a larger context, or I grew up in Alberta, but I live on the west coast, and so the ocean is this sort of, I have a funny relationship to moving to the ocean, and the water systems that are in Vancouver provide a lot of knowledge about how to situate yourself in relation to that place. So last year I was having a conversation with a woman from Musqueam, which is one of the local First Nations in Vancouver. She was explaining to me the word for Fraser River in Hunkaminam, which I don't know, it's pronounced something like Stalo, which just means river. But then the Hunkaminam word for bus, uses that root word of Stalo, but it just means big canoe. Through the language and the way that the Musqueam are thinking about navigating their place and coming to know that place through navigation, through this symbol of the canoe and the historical, relationship that they have to that. I just thought that was such a great way of thinking about the way that the urban landscape is navigated in similar ways through this word. So, and I just in terms of how each of you are coming to a knowledge of a place through your relationship to water, whether it's this sort of bureaucratic process that you went through, or your family being from this specific place and how you navigate that.
In opposition to the roots of the word, I come from like a city place and then go back into kind of a belief system, how I that language, and then thinking about sort of geography as well, and it's quality based, and how you would extend this into a waterway system, try and sort of find a way to make that work.
So how did you think about visually creating the psychogeography and the different sort of movements within your video?
Well, I guess it was always an observation of putting myself in a position where I just had to sit back and let anything happen. And I knew that all sorts of things would happen, but being accepting to all of that, and to be aware that all these things were happening, but have no direct influence on them as well, so just letting it wash over. So visually it came through video just so I could see everything, and it sort of was a second pair of eyes to some extent. And so I could feel like I wasn't disrupting the daily routine of everyone that's making this trip. So that was.
You also have two views in the video, so you kind of gain this doubled perspective, and so the narrative is kind of, it's a little bit more interwoven, and so the way that you experience time in your work is really interesting too.
And to disrupt sort of the logic of having a narrative trip being just given back to you. I'm on this boat, I'm on several boats, and the scale is getting smaller and smaller, so I want everyone else to feel like they're shifting and their sort of perspectives are being changed, and the unknown or the ambiguity or the ominous nature of it at some points is hopefully reflected. Me being an observer was a position that I wanted everyone else to have as well. Something that the work could give. And there's no entry or exit into the work. The screen's kind of how can that arrive at any point and leave at any point and still kind of have some sort of connection to it or a snippet that will
I found it interesting that people read your work as kind of being sinister in a way.
I did too.
That was ominous or sinister, and I'm wondering how to unpack that a little bit, because I think it's also something to do with the water and the fact that you're privileging that space. Yeah.
Because when we visited the work, it was very familiar to you. You instantly said you knew you could have a similar feeling that I imagine I had. And so when I had a chat with the docents, pretty much the first thing that a few of them said was, "Oh, that was unnerving. It was sort of ominous. There was something sinister and evil about it. All these men." They were quite kind of like, oh, I don't know what to think.
You arrive in the dark, you're not sure
it was that kind of nature, and I was thinking, these are just simple people trying to get provisions to them. Leave them alone. So that was really interesting, and I'd never seen that because I have a relationship with trying to unpack the identity in these works. For me personally, but I get quite defensive when they see these sorts of things. It's not on my radar, and being an observer and how you kind of funnel that is interesting.
Well, I wonder if, because I noticed the experience in this space is like the roar of the motor is quite an experience, and Marianne's reaction was, oh, that's such a familiar sound, right? Because your trip to Kingdom is, you experienced a very similar place and physical kind of environment when you're going through that. And this is, as an artist, when you're creating work, there's, as I was alluding to before, there's this whole personal experience that happens leading up, but then how it's received at the other end, right? Like that's kind of out of your hands in a way. So, what are you hoping to leave people with? Like how? I mean, I know for some artists, letting go or having that, go in all these other directions, or maybe be interpreted in a way that is not at all what you expected. For some artists, that's really challenging, and for some, they're really good at, like, they just let it go, or they once that's done and out there. Especially with the work like yours, Marianne, where there's the story there is, you have a very clear focus in what you're presenting. So what, I guess there's a few questions in that, but...
Well, and you work in public artwork so much of the time. So how are you taking into consideration that place where you're citing it, and how, how that work too might be read by a non-educated international audience, where it's also being placed among all these other representations of indigeneity within that space.
Yes, it is really interesting because I would, if you think about the context of the airport itself, there's a narrative in all those pieces and the history behind that collection, and the work itself. Even though, I think the difficulty in creating that piece was to create a piece that would somewhat disrupt that narrative, but not do it in such a way that the piece wouldn't be made. So it had to fit, to some extent, their objectives and what they're creating, even though I actually, and it was very, very interesting because what ended up happening was I ended up turning the opening into a performance piece. And I asked certain people to come and bear witness to what had happened, and when I was given my 3 minutes to give a speech regarding the work, within all this corporate speech making, I specifically congratulated the airport for helping to make Indigenous peoples visible, but that now was the time to start to listen to what Indigenous people are saying. And so for me, that piece, when I look at it in comparison to the rest of my practice, it does not appear to have the more overt politicization of my other works, but within that specific context, extremely political, because it was the furthest that I could push the boundaries of what they would allow within that space. And the other consideration why I backed down on the text is because I thought, and they said this to me specifically, we knew your work was political and we let you in the door, and now you've gone in defiance and you've gone too far. And I thought, okay, if I push this, then the door will be slammed, and other people who may come behind me to further push the boundaries of what's happening. Because there is an official text which basically says internationally everything is fine and with Indigenous peoples in this province. And I guess I kind of wanted to disrupt that narrative somewhat. So in my own opinion, there is success there in having done that, even though the text was rejected. But it was interesting.
Does that rejection become, as every time you speak about it, or, obviously knowledge is gained that there's this missing, or there was something that has to be taken away. Is that starting to be an awareness that people know that happened?
Yeah, kind of strategically find places to tell that story, and then, so, I thought you could fight it then and there, and everyone would know, and it would be, or you could allow it to happen, and then, no one can tell me not to tell this story. So, because there was an actual threat of taking the work down. It was already built, and they said, literally, take it off or take it down. That's what they said to me. So I thought I can advocate through different ways, and that's what's really intriguing about our works, is that they have a life and extension, and they exist in context. So you can create one for an exhibition, but it will, depending on where it goes and how people talk about it, it provides a platform for advocacy, I guess, the ability then to talk about these issues.
So it's a very much an expanded sense of activism in terms of the personal work that we are each doing within our practices, and then how that gets translated into public discussions like these, right? So I really, I do like to think about that word in a broader sense, I think.
We're going again. Maybe to kind of offer some other directions or different ways we can think about water in this context. Some of the umbrellas, as we kind of have on our activity over there, some of the umbrellas with which we're looking at this larger project that we're calling Aukafolau is looking at water as resource, water as a site of trade and exchange, and water in relation to climate change. And while there's a lot of overlap with that, those also allow, I think a key part of this is that we didn't want to limit at the outset, we didn't want to create too much of a framework that would limit ideas from coming in. So underneath each of those things could imply so many paths to take to talk about this. So thinking about those like rivers, to your work, Marianne, like rivers as resource, the implications also connect to how people live in that space. So, how living near water or resources to water being restricted, how that impacts where we are in the place we're in. So maybe we could talk a bit about water as resource, because that kind of implies so many different things. In Tonga it brings resources. It was a highway in a way to bring to those resources. It brings food. It connects you to resources upstream. When you're thinking about fish and the journey they take. So just thinking around thoughts of that about as a site of resource.
What's really what I'm trying to do is being in a place that is so land-based
in general, and so it's
to
like
being in Berlin and having these issues around water, and it being on a local level when it's there. How do I extend that to a global level when it's somewhere else? And what kind of ways can I introduce or kind of advocate these ideas, and what sort of how that becomes accessible to someone who hasn't been in these places, and I have these personal relationships. How do I represent or present in any such a personal experience or a personal kind of identity with these water as resource to places that have a global impact and are making these industrial decisions that are affecting smaller communities, and exchange what happens, what can they do? Yeah, it's hard. I don't have an answer for it, but like what sort of, I'm just thinking like what sort of solutions or what sort of things can people start doing? It's getting to a point where it's just going too quickly. And we were talking the other day about how everyone has to kind of stop this and just say, back off from both sides. So where do we come in and kind of initiate or negotiate that space where we can offer different ideas or offer different pathways as a contention for this resource.
So Maddie's work is just showing the absurdity of how those systems actually operate and affect the exchange of resource, and how much of an impossibility it is on a personal level to try to move things around in a global context in that way.
I was just reading a little bit more about the situation in New Zealand. I think New Zealanders are realising that there is this notion of this water resource that is in this kind of largely unregulated situation, that the New Zealand government's position is that nobody owns water, and therefore the local governments are kind of in some ways compelled to give these consents to companies from China, from America, from or there's a Lekwungen company extracting water, and I think I was reading, by comparison, the dairying industry in New Zealand again takes this extraordinary water resource to produce this amount of milk powder, and so New Zealand is sort of suddenly thinking, we would have a much more kind of beneficial, and less environmental impact if we were just actually using our own water resource, but we've given these permits put water in bottles, move water around pipe water somewhere, and what those issues are. Are they similar? You know, that you know, it's something. I think people, governments are also realising very quickly that it's going to become this extremely contested space of who, in a country like Canada and New Zealand, with rich water resources.
Yeah. I mean, for us in Canada, it's a conversation around water going into the States.
Yeah.
California is getting drier by the year. But then there are also companies like Nestle that extract water from BC as well.
It was interesting for me because I moved from Australia to Canada at a point when Australia had been in a very long period of drought, like 10 years of drought, and water was like you paid for it, you couldn't, so many water restrictions, and it was just incredible to live in a country where you could have as long as showers on, you could turn the hose on, wash, you can't people spread the drought. It's something you don't even think about. You don't even think about it. It's so much bigger. But actually what I'm interested here is how the activism also becomes a form, like in all of your work, becomes a form of stewardship, actually, with the relationship between those two ideas. I think that's what kind of working
Sure, I was thinking about, related to that, thinking of water as a resource in another sense. Not something that is sold for profit, but as a resource for our food and the health of our Indigenous communities, and how that's been under threat with developments like the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I organized a walk around an exhibition that I curated called Unsettled Sites at SFU Gallery on Burnaby Mountain. And the walk was led by Cease Weiss, who's from the Squamish Nation, among others, but is an ethnobotanist and has this knowledge of indigenous plants and the medicines and the traditional uses of them. And then Adam Gold, who is a young man that was really involved with the pipeline protests around when Kinder Morgan was doing, they were drilling boreholes into Burnaby Mountain to do testing, because that's the site where they were planning to, are still planning to twin the pipeline, and it's a conservation area, so there was a lot of uproar from the community about this. And so the two of them took this group on a walk together down from the top of the mountain where the gallery is sited to one of the sites where they had this borehole, and every few minutes, and it was just maybe a month ago, there was so many berries, and every few minutes Cease would stop and just pull up another plant that was at the side of the road that you would just, if you didn't know, you would just walk by it, and would tell us about all of these different important uses that the plant has. And we ate so many things from the forest, and then we went down to this borehole site, and Adam talked about the organizing of the protests there, and this was kind of a way to situate the work that was happening within the exhibition that was encountered in this very specific space in the larger context of the site of the mountain and all of the work that's happening there, which is, the conversation was based around the land there, but the water is just beyond, and it's all affected because it's all connected. So it was a really powerful way, I felt, to bring those conversations together. And we were talking a little bit about at lunch yesterday about how we need to bring people together in conversation that aren't necessarily just those people that support and are like-minded, but also that, that moves into a place of contention, possibly.
I think in that vein too, also across disciplines, because how you know, like working with somebody in ethnobotany, you know, overlapping with projects that are considered art projects. Marianne, when she first started talking to us about this, her research and work, I've been talking to scientists, and by sharing the conversation across disciplines, you can expand the reach of who is hearing about this. You know, that this, we're not necessarily going to reach everyone through the vehicle that is art, but we do have opportunity for platforms that may not be available to other disciplines. But in the same way, if we expand the people we bring into the conversation, then that can reach people who may not otherwise encounter that.
But I think though that sometimes in doing that, art tends to, you know, when you are working with scientists or people who of those, you know, there is a like-mindedness towards a project. Actually, for me, it's something about actually putting your work into an airport, or you know, when you're dealing with a corporation and business and an industry. It's actually, I think that's where artists somehow, that's where the conversation needs to go, because I think you can have these cross-disciplinary conversations that have a supportiveness towards each other, though they have differences. But to me, it's really, maybe the urgency is to go, actually, you know, you need to sit at the board table with
across sectors
of people kind of dealing at that level, because that's where things can perhaps change. But I don't know, I get this frustration sometimes that we're kind of doing things that, you know, aren't kind of moving up to that level. It's like, so and that would be the optimism, is how do you actually start having artists have conversations, or be this idea of with the company supporting the pipelines, how to be at those tables.
I think it's interesting, Marianne's experience with the airport and your experience with the oil company executives. Like, I really want to know what they thought at the end of that meeting. It's like they go away kind of going, what was that about? And that's kind of what.
But I think, you know, it's so interesting because it's in that moment that an artwork can happen. You know, it's like you have this idea. I mean, even the fact that, you know, you having to have that conversation where people have to sit there and go, you know, they're thinking about this text, you know, and they wouldn't have been thinking about it otherwise, you know, and they're thinking about their resistance to it. And they kind of then looking at the point that they've made something have to change. I don't know, like,
it also challenges artists and curators or people in the research realm to really, and this came up yesterday, to really be grounded in what you are trying to say and know your facts and understand what you're saying, because you are challenging these bigger entities, and they may come back and you have those confrontations or those conversations where you're not speaking to the converted. It's not just a big love-in of, yes, this is what we need to be doing. You do hit that wall, and when you do, if you're not grounded, you know, you get plowed over. So that's an important challenge too, because I think maybe if we are always speaking to the converted, it doesn't up the ante. It doesn't push us.
And I think this is where public art projects are so, you know, just need to. There's still so much complacency or kind of rhetoric around. You know, we need this thing, and it's really part of an aesthetic of a place, or it's adding, you know, maybe, you know, like, but those works that are actually challenging some of those. Or trying to move the way that we think about a public art situation or a site-specific situation along, you know, I find those spaces, I mean, they're so difficult and they're so confronting, you know, but in some ways they're really vital.
In the
sort
case
of vitalization of them.
In the case of the walk, it was definitely not a confrontational space, but it was revisiting of a space that hadn't been active for quite some time, and we did participate in trespassing on the site because now Kinder Morgan has blocked off that site and has planted trees in the path that you were supposed to try to navigate. So we were, you know, crawling in the bush as this big group of 20 people. So there's, you know, there was maybe a gentler form of education and remembrance happening there, but. But then, I mean, the way that your work was circulating in the process of its making and travel, it would not even necessarily, it's not necessarily being recognized as an artwork. It's traversing as a different type of object entirely. That's one thing that I wanted to ask you about, was when you were trying to bring it into the country, were you labeling it in any specific way as an artwork to try to maybe help?
Yeah. And I always think that's a really interesting point of what is the label of an artwork? What kind of passage does it give something? It was clear that it was going to Jakarta Biennale Foundation, and it was, but I think I think it did have to have just a very, practical description of, water, whales, I think that idea of when what the word artwork does to confuse things even further, it's always an interesting situation. I mean, the risk, I think, is, of course, what I'm saying, the risk is that you risk this kind of invisibility, or else, if we're artists, we just go back into this combat with, where we, this notion of being activist and then trying to work with these businesses or corporations who are just going to go, actually, you're just a pain in the ass, and we just want something that lights up. That's right. And so, that's the risk, I think, is that there would be closure. So I think it's just such a delicate and interesting thing to attempt to do.
Well, and I think Marianne spoke to that really well, in that she used, you use these opportunities as a platform, and you don't compromise your integrity when you're going through that process, but you also feel a big sense of responsibility to your community, right? And so it is, you're entering this realm of negotiation and really challenging. And again, and this is the thing, is where you stand on things. You don't waver. And so when you go into that, you can, how far you're willing to go. But you're constantly having to reassess that and challenge yourself. And that kind of self-reflexivity to know how far you're willing to go. And that's, that idea of risk again, like how much. I mean, I think artists in general, what you do with your practice is you're putting yourself out there. There's, you're risking your ideas, your thoughts, you're putting those out there to be taken in and talked about and considered by people, and there's just a risk in that act. But when you're taking these topics that challenge corporations, challenge dominant ideology, there's a huge responsibility in that, and knowing where you sit in all of that is really integral to the outcome. Right?
Thank you. I mean, I would always make work with my community of family in mind. So when I do take these risks, I will always know that they're taking them as well.
Yeah.
And so that's concerning to some extent, because they don't have this platform all the time. So I'm here, I'm in this position, but they're with me also. So it's being mindful and respectful of that, but knowing that at a point you're kind of their voice, and how you navigate and negotiate that space without. I mean, I don't care about upsetting other people. I'm quite happy to do that. They don't want to upset them because they mean a lot more to me, and it's their stories that I want to tell or to educate. Well, that's the history that I want to be involved with. So, risk-taking is such an interesting sort of position to put yourself in when you have lots of people just here, and how that is then shared with other people. I go in and out. I sort of don't sometimes, and then I go, oh no, they're lying. Don't say anything. So when you think about responsibility in that way, it's an interesting position, because I will always make work as a we, not an I, and that's really important. And I'm wondering if that sort of approach to like a local and a global, and how how everyone should sort of take that position and sort of share information in that way, or education in that way, so it's not sort of like an individualistic approach to these things. How do you find anything in such a big sort of, I mean, if you think about the TPP or things like that, how do you just individually go into something like you need a wealth of information and they're complex and just overarching sort of themes? I don't know how personally to be involved in something like that, but if I think of it in a communal way, I feel like a little bit more progress can be made, and maybe that's how we kind of get into these positions where we're fighting the system.
I think it's completely terrifying when it comes to the issue of water, because there's this whole notion of privatization of water, and then we're like, wait a minute, like, as human beings, what is our relationship to water? What happens if you privatize that? And so that struggle is going to become only more and more extreme. Like in Alberta, there's all kinds of issues around how much water is needed for the industry, and then in BC we're looking at the same issues kind of further in the north, and it's really frightening. And I guess this notion of the commons, or what is in the best interest of the whole, over this notion of privatization and individualization of rights. And that's what we're really fighting in our communities right now, is because the accepted platform for negotiation is privatization and individualization and capitalism. And so it's gonna get crazy.
And it's actually even happening in terms of the ethnobotany that you're speaking about, where the privatization of or the ownership of genetic species.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Actually wondering, as artists, like, there's ways you can work that are kind of trying to butt up against this system, or there are ways which you can work that kind of try to disarm the system. Like, and I think there's something important about being able to work in that disarming way.
Well, I was thinking about what you said about being in sort of stewardship, and I think, I think I increasingly recognise, and I would say maybe there's this idea of this catalytic relationship of I think now that where a project starts and it ends, or it doesn't, it sort of never ends, in this idea of the conversations that you continually have. So I find every time I describe a project, then I'm really interested in the way people might have to imagine that scenario and what that catalyses, but also I think in the way that the process unfolds. Right? So I think I now knowingly understand my own role within the project where I go. So I'm going to go and next week I'm going to visit a granite quarry in Pitt Meadows. And I know that, and they're like, why do you want to come? And so I start this process, and I love, actually at the border the other day when I came into Canada, I was like, the border guard was like, so why are you here? And I'm like, I'm researching a project for this gallery. What are you researching? And I said, aspects around the Fraser River, and they said, so what about the Fraser River? And I said, actually, the Simon Fraser Monument at New Westminster. What about the Simon Fraser Monument? I was like, I wish I had taken the opportunity to take 10 minutes to kind of detail, and use that. But it's this idea that actually every conversation maybe becomes, that's I guess a dialogic sort of approach where those things you're aware that, because it's like, where is the artwork actually happening in a project? Like, that's why I think, there's ideas of hearing about this story of the thing that is missing, or may yet go back on the work in the future, or those things become, because there's those tensions, and I have to believe that something will happen. But then I think, and I was thinking before in the context in Indonesia, it was also very important for me to recognise that I was literally completely at sea then in that context. I was out of place in the way things operated in the Indonesian world around. It was fascinating, and not under, I was in several long conversations with people speaking only in Bahasa, and then loving the situation of suddenly I'd get like this interpretation that was 5 words, and that there's just it's like, I know there's a lot more being said right here and not being told it, and actually you have to laugh. You have to go, yeah, of course. Like, why would you tell that? And just I think those things are really always really fascinating. But what was the word you used just before? We were talking in that question you had. So I was saying stewardship and catalyst, and then you were saying
Disarming.
Yeah.
So they were disarming you.
Yeah, they were totally disarming. And it was.
That's actually kind of
I knew they were telling me things that they knew what I wanted to hear, and they were telling me narrative. They involved themselves in this shaggy dog story as much, and going, it was great.
I mean, it's making me think about, in a Canadian context, how the issue of water is going to be approached in different ways, from an Indigenous perspective, from a settler's perspective, or an immigrant's perspective, and how those negotiations need to take place differently. So for settlers, it needs to be like an unlearning or an unsettling around ideas of the connection between water and capital, or resource extraction, and more education around Indigenous epistemologies towards water and those sorts of things. So navigating this place in India where it's like, you recognize that you're only able to come on this kind of surface level. You're only there's a word that I'm trying to say, but I can't quite get it. There's only certain types of knowledge that you're privileged to, right? And you have to kind of stay within that limitation, working in that system.
And I think too, we're talking about not just across disciplines, but maybe across sectors, like branching into that corporate realm, or to make those conversations reach the people who can actually shift things that are maybe going, as people who are thinking through creative processes, there's no shortage of ideas and possible solutions, but there's not the same kind of resources at our disposal to really shift the bigger structure. And maybe it's like any relationship. Those relationships take time and understanding and finding a common language. I think there's a way that we might talk about things, like you're talking about how to explain the border card, what you were doing. There's a shorthand we might have when we talk to each other that, and then likewise when we're trying to get information and we realize we're only getting 5 words of, conveyed to us of what could be a bigger understanding. So those relationships are, there has to be a willfulness on both sides to kind of reach a way of talking through it. Because the other thing that has come up as we're talking through these ideas is agendas. People have an agenda that they want to see move forward, and how can okay, so I'll jump onto that, but how does it benefit me? And that idea of thinking about us or we as opposed to me or individual or capitalist kind of gain or perspectives, like what can we gain? What are we going to, what do we get out of this? I don't know the answer to how we shift that way of thinking. But if we're approaching it in a way where it's a matter of building time and trust and a language that allows us to kind of talk through the muck of, and that may not be willful from both sides, right? So that's the challenge. If that doesn't get opened up, if there isn't a willful kind of shared conversation or invitation, then what, right? Like how do we get ourselves at those tables, and how do you then insert yourself?
I guess my own personal belief from experience is you have to do it from the ground up now, because we were, like, Indigenous people have been brought to the table to negotiate, and industry and government have been there, but industry and government have the power to set the agenda, and they say you can only come in and make these certain types of adjustments, and none of them are fundamental. So I really believe in outreach to the grassroots, to people on the ground, who would then force and fight for and force fundamental change in governance, and that's a huge task, it seems like. But if you look at something like like the very fact that the NDP actually allowed this thing called the Leach Manifesto into their conference, like, that's interesting that even happened at all, even though it was like highly criticized and somewhat booted out the door. At the same time, they're contained within that document are real changes, and people say, oh, that's a lot of this type of thinking is very naive and impossible, but realistically, we've sat at those tables, but the people in power, with power and privilege, are not going to give up that power and privilege without a strong push from the grassroots. And so when I'm thinking through my artworks, I'm really thinking about the everyday person as an audience, and attempting to kind of articulate that through an art practice.
If people have any thoughts that they're still kind of wanting to share on that, or we can wind down the conversation too, and we have a community member if you want to contribute at all. Our community members have come and gone, and now we have his here, but
I was here at the very beginning.
Well, creative artists, they're expressing themselves. I don't know if you have
So I
any.
wish I was here for all of it, because I keep coming back to that decision by YVR to take away the text, so I when I was with my daughter and her friend doing other things and coming back, I still think about that and think about on some level it was okay, and that you were able to do that. It still was like embedded in the piece, even if it wasn't there. And I kind of want to go there and sort of see it and see that text there.
Yeah, now that you know.
Yeah, now that I know, but just when you were speaking at the end there about the creating work for the people rather than the sort of positions of power, that grassroots impact. It's just, yeah. I don't have anything
No, that's great.
articulate, but I appreciate this conversation about water, and also the different approaches to that, and that settler perspective, and realizing and separating it out from the from capital water as a means of furthering capitalism. So I think that's all really a really, really important conversation to articulate the different approaches.
Yeah, in terms of stewardship, it's about, I think, stewarding opportunities for settler people to see things in a different light, and to give them, to think about how to be good visitors and that kind of thing. So I know a lot of artists that facilitate that kind of work.
Displacing that logic of capital, though. It's like, it's huge. It's phenomenal. Lucy and I actually went and did a talk at the Asia Pacific Foundation. It's incredible. It was kind of like sitting around the table with the oil.
Right.
The oil.
Okay.
Like, guys.
Yeah.
You got to test where you stood on
Silence. Was there silence?
It was kind of silence and lots of defensiveness. And the way Lucy held her ground was just really incredible.
Yeah.
That this logic in their mind of this need to produce more cheap stuff. And it was like, how could you even think outside of that? And I'm like, what kinds of crazy people are you? But it's that we all want more cheap stuff.
Yeah, that forced assumption, right? Obviously, everyone wants that.
It's like talking like you're aliens on both sides kind of thing. But it was pretty remarkable.
But they invited you, right? You were
They did.
invited.
Yeah.
Which is interesting as well.
Yeah.
What was their reason for inviting you?
I think they were curious more than anything else, but there'd also been a history of sort of discussion. And I think, I don't know, I think there's a lot there that we can speculate on.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it is like sitting around the table with the oil magnates, whoever they are, where you just know that you've planted some seed of something, and you can't really know what that is, but they're probably going to go away, and it'll turn over in some
And it
form.
can be cumulative, right? I mean, this is the thing is I think with any sort of shift or change or awakening or awareness that can come around, we have to be patient, because if we rush things, like if you really wanted to prove your point with that installation and ram it home, you know that there would be a negative impact. So you pulled back a bit and you said, okay, this is where I'll stop. This is as far as I'll push, and I'll stop here. And next time I can get to a few more people. And when you were able to give your talk, you were able to say what you needed to say. And so it's that thing where these things will take time. There are all these little conversations, these panels you get invited to, where you can insert a bit more of that into to a broader forum, to people in these different positions of power, right, and of influence, and hopefully that accumulation, you can see things swing and then it can shift, right? So I guess there's we just have to have approach it with a space of calm, because these issues can really feel, I mean, we get passionate about them, we get distressed by them, they're upsetting, and we want to see it stop. But it's the real challenge of having the courage to really know that eventually a shift will happen if there's like a steady, solid move towards that shift.
And we were talking at lunch yesterday about how when faced with a contrasting viewpoint, people often tend to react emotionally.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So to try to bring the conversation to a different level, where people will be open to hearing what you have to say.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
kind of the challenge.
I think what's interesting is also being in that. I think we're sometimes, people are afraid of artworks and artists, and and I did have this. I think one of the most
amazing experiences in terms of piece of feedback I ever got. Same project where I sat with the oil tycoons around the table, but I spoke about that project on the radio in New Zealand, and then I got an email a few days later. Someone had sort of tracked me down, and there was a guy who'd been listening on a Sunday morning, and he wrote to me saying, when you first started talking, I hated your project. I hated what you talked about. I had this issue, that issue, the other thing, and then and he was writing to me to tell me the idea that he'd actually kind of thought about it, and it was interesting. But I also think that as artists, I feel really conscious of the fact that of not always being in this position of sort of like righteousnness that I'm just waiting for everyone to come around to what I'm doing, and I think it's so important that people could still come and go. Actually, I've got a real issue with what you're talking about as an artist. I just want people to say I hate your project, but that's fine. Just tell me why. Don't just say I hate it, but tell me why you hate it. And then I think that's the point where you get somewhere. Because and it's not that artists are going to be upset by that. It's not that we're trying to sort of be missionaries for that artwork makes the world a better place. But I think it's this point, this tension point, maybe.
And even better when I hate your work and then I've reflected on it and now it's transformed in some way too.
That was extraordinary. I think. And that's just, and I think that's it. And you think, well, actually, that's just one person, but
one person that articulated that, but maybe
and
more.
And I felt then my responsibility was to then make sure that I didn't just receive that, I engaged in a conversation with the email with him, and it was, I think that's interesting.
And then there's a tension too here between sort of having the artwork be able to do what it does autonomously as an artwork, and then the risk of artworks being instrumentalized or co-opted for other agendas, which, obviously Indigenous art in the public realm is especially a good example of that.
I wanted to wrap it up by pointing out my Swedish water bottle I bought at the airport. It's filled with BC tap water. Fantastic. Just for the globalness of the conversation.
I remember when we went up to Alert Bay, Marianne telling us about how good the water in Alert Bay was. It's really good water.
Yeah, I know.
I had some in a water bottle and I got home and I was still drinking the water and I was like, it's good water.
My last little bit of Alert Bay.
Yeah, I said I was at work with Michelle and I'm like, I'm drinking the last of my Alert Bay water. Yeah. Does anyone have any closing thoughts, or do you want to contribute any thoughts on water issues, or?
I'll say that I've lived in several remote First Nations communities, and they've all had delicious water.
All right,
Let's keep it that way.
Yeah, let's keep the water, good water in those communities. Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here and part in this conversation, and I hope there are many, many more. And as I mentioned, this is part of our bigger project, Wawikiala, and the pervasiveness of water, or cannot go against the tide, because I think there's still working through all the ideas that could come to around this topic, but there'll be more evolving around this project, so I'm hoping to bring all of you back at some point into this conversation, but we'll find a way to keep you in the loop of how this all takes shape. So thank you everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Is that working towards some kind of exhibition as well?
Yeah, the exhibition will be in the future, so it's an ongoing project that will kind of take form and evolve over several years. So this is kind of the first pre-program as part of that bigger project. So we've kind of launched something here. So it's a really exciting day. We're trying a bit of an experiment to see what kind of things came out of this conversation. So it feels really exciting. It feels like we're building towards something that we're not sure where it's going, but it kind of feels really exciting. We feel like we might be risking some things and we're a little terrified. So this is all good. I think that's a good sign when you're a little bit terrified.
We've had a really great soundtrack.
Yes.
Right?
I think we need to try out some of these activities because everything sounds really amazing. And thank you to DIY Life and Open Space because this has been an amazing opportunity to be in this space. So thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Now we can eat fish and chips. Thank you MediaNet and Faustine for videography, recording all of these ideas.